The jungle was alive with death. November 1943. Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The air burned with salt, gunpowder, and heat thick enough to choke a man. Japanese defenders, crouched in concrete pillboxes, listened to the approaching roar, not of tanks or planes this time, but of men. From the smoke emerged shapes, helmets low, rifles raised, faces smeared with blackened mud. U.S. Marines, soaked, bleeding, half drowned from the surf, advanced without hesitation. Machine guns tore through the air, cutting men down in lines. Yet still they came, crawling, firing, shouting. The sound of their rifles echoed closer and closer until it was no longer distant thunder, but a heartbeat pounding through the island. For the Japanese, it was the first time the myth of the invincible Imperial soldier met something unyielding, something that refused to break, even when shredded by fire. They called them devils in human form, and from that moment forward, Japanese troops learned one truth of the Pacific War. They feared no enemy more than the United States Marine Corps. By late 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become the world's largest battlefield. What had begun with Japan's lightning victories, from the Philippines to Singapore, from Guam to the Dutch East Indies, was starting to unravel. The empire's war machine had reached its limit. Supplies stretched thin, ships sunk faster than they could be built, and the illusion of unstoppable conquest began to fracture under the strain of attrition. Then came a name that would echo through the Pacific: Guadalcanal. It was there, in August 1942, that American forces, primarily U.S. Marines, made their first major offensive of the war. For Japan, it was the first time they faced an enemy willing to fight to the last, not from fanaticism, but from sheer determination and discipline. The Imperial Japanese Army had built its reputation on ruthless courage. Its soldiers fought to the death, taught from birth that surrender was shameful. Against most opponents, Chinese, British, Dutch, that spirit had crushed resistance. But on Guadalcanal, the Japanese found themselves facing men who fought differently. The Marines did not retreat when outnumbered, nor panic when isolated. They dug in, held fast, and counterattacked in the dead of night. For months, the two sides battled across ridgelines and jungles soaked with rain and blood. The Japanese commanders were stunned. Their reports described Americans who seemed impervious to exhaustion, who moved with clockwork precision even under artillery bombardment. The Marines were not the largest army in the world, nor the best equipped, but they were professional killers, honed by brutal training and bound by a code of unity that rivaled Japan's own Bushido. The U.S. Marine Corps, long considered America's smallest branch, had found its purpose. Amphibious assault was their art, coordination between sea, air, and land, their symphony. And in the Pacific, every island became a stage for that relentless rhythm of destruction. When Guadalcanal finally fell in February 1943, it marked more than a victory. It marked a shift in fear. For the first time, the Japanese High Command began to speak with caution about this enemy. They called them land demons, men who fought through malaria, hunger, and darkness without losing morale. The Marines' ability to coordinate with naval gunfire and aircraft created a level of precision the Japanese could not match. In Tokyo's war rooms, officers began recalculating. Every new engagement with the Marines cost hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives. Each small island became a fortress that was eventually reduced to rubble, and yet the Americans always advanced. By 1943, Japan's commanders understood a grim truth. Defending against the Marines meant death. But surrender was unthinkable. Thus began a pattern that would define the rest of the Pacific campaign, an endless cycle of suicidal defense and unstoppable assault, from the black sands of Tarawa to the coral ridges of Peleliu. The Imperial Army would throw everything it had at the Americans and discover again and again, that no fire, no ambush, and no trap could break the will of a U.S. Marine. To understand why Japanese soldiers came to hate and fear fighting U.S. Marines above all others, one must look deeper than the battlefield. It began in the soul of two warrior cultures that could not be more different. Japan's Imperial Army was built upon Bushido, the ancient samurai code of honor. Its soldiers were indoctrinated from youth to believe that death in service to the emperor was the highest virtue. Captivity was shame, surrender, a stain upon one's ancestors. This belief shaped everything: how they fought, how they lived, and ultimately, how they died. American Marines, by contrast, were not driven by divine loyalty, but by a creed of brotherhood and endurance. Their ethos was simple: no man left behind. It was practical, not mystical. Yet it forged a bond as unbreakable as any spiritual oath. Marines fought not for the emperor or ideology, but for the man beside them. That difference would prove decisive in every jungle, every coral reef, and every ridge where the two forces met. By 1943, Japanese military intelligence had begun gathering detailed reports on this enemy. What they discovered disturbed them. The Marines were not reckless. They were methodical. They attacked after days of bombardment, coordinated with aircraft and naval gunfire, and used deception and infiltration rather than frontal banzai charges. Their logistics were unmatched. Crates of ammunition and supplies appeared on beaches that Japanese defenders thought impossible to land on. To the Japanese, who had been trained to see the Western soldier as weak and soft, this discipline was alien. Even when wounded, Marines continued to fight. Even under night assaults, they held their lines with organized fire control. Captured diaries and field orders revealed Japanese officers struggling to comprehend how such men existed. One commander wrote from Tarawa, "They do not fear death as the British do, nor do they boast like the Australians. These Marines kill with silence and precision. They come for us as if they were machines." But the Marines were not machines. They were human to the core. That humanity, paradoxically, made them terrifying. They buried their dead with care, treated prisoners when possible, and returned to battle without hatred. To the Japanese mind, shaped by absolute devotion and emotional detachment, such behavior was incomprehensible. Every new battle deepened this psychological divide. At Betio, Marines advanced across open water under withering fire, accepting losses that would have broken most armies, and still pressed forward. On New Britain, they turned jungle warfare into an art, coordinating mortars, snipers, and flamethrowers in perfect synchronization. By mid-1944, the Imperial High Command had reached a grim conclusion. American Marines were not merely soldiers. They were a phenomenon, a force of nature. Reports began circulating among units stationed across the Pacific. If the Marines are coming, prepare to die. This was not propaganda. It was survival instinct. The Japanese soldier, raised to fear dishonor more than death, found in the Marines an enemy who reversed that equation. Men who feared nothing at all, not even the impossible. The stage was set for the bloodiest confrontations of the Pacific War. The Japanese would fortify every inch of coral and volcanic ash, determined to make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. And the Marines would come again and again until the rising sun fell beneath the Pacific waves. The Pacific War was more than a contest of weapons. It was a collision of psychology, endurance, and belief. To the Japanese, the Marine was not simply an enemy soldier. He was a contradiction, a man who embodied both savagery and discipline. To the Marines, the Japanese was not just an opponent. He was a ghost in the jungle, invisible, determined, and relentless. Between them, a dark respect was born, one forged in exhaustion, terror, and mutual recognition of human extremes. The average Marine who stormed those beaches was 19 years old. He carried 70 pounds of gear, a rifle that jammed in salt water, and a pack that would rot in the Pacific humidity. For weeks, sometimes months, he lived without sleep. His uniform soaked, his skin infected with sores. The heat and stench of death were constant, and yet he fought. The Japanese noticed this. At Guadalcanal, their scouts observed Marines repairing weapons under fire, cooking rations in shell holes, or digging foxholes with bleeding hands. "They are beasts of burden," wrote one Japanese officer. "They do not stop." This endurance wasn't born from fanaticism. It came from training and cohesion. The U.S. Marine Corps had drilled its men in every conceivable hardship. Forced marches, live fire exercises, discipline under chaos. It all became instinct. Where the Japanese soldier fought to die with honor, the Marine fought to stay alive and ensure victory. That simple difference, survival versus sacrifice, shaped every outcome. The Japanese army had once believed no Western force could adapt to the tropics. The jungles of Southeast Asia had humbled the British and Dutch. But the Marines rewrote that assumption. They learned quickly that the jungle was not an obstacle. It was cover. Patrols moved silently, guided by instinct and small unit cohesion. Squads operated like clockwork, riflemen advancing while bar gunners laid suppressive fire, machine gunners anchoring the line, flamethrowers clearing the unseen. At Cape Gloucester and Bougainville, Marines fought battles at distances measured in feet, not yards. Visibility was 10 meters, humidity near 100%. The air was thick with insects, mud, and decay, yet their formations held. Japanese officers, trained in mass attacks, could not comprehend this style of warfare. Their human wave charges broke apart against coordinated Marine defenses. Their bunkers, once invincible against frontal assaults, were reduced one by coordinated demolition teams and flamethrowers. The Marines did not fight with emotion. They fought with rhythm. A flamethrower's burst, a grenade's thump, a single rifle shot. Then silence, each move calculated, each death methodical. At night, when Japanese infiltrators crept through the darkness with bayonets and grenades, Marine lines lit up in controlled bursts of fire. They had perfected the art of killing without panic. As these patterns repeated across island after island, something began to change. The Japanese soldiers who survived long enough to fight the Marines again carried the memory of that terror with them. Captured letters tell the story. One reads, "The Marines fight like demons. They crawl forward even after being hit. They are not afraid of dying, and their dead stare at us as if still watching." To the Imperial Army, used to crushing colonial troops and militia, this was a new kind of enemy, not superior in numbers, but in will. The Marines' refusal to retreat became a legend. Every Japanese platoon sent to hold an island knew that once the Marines landed, they would not leave until the island was theirs, or destroyed. That realization turned hatred into obsession. The Japanese did not just despise the Marines, they defined themselves against them. To lose against the Marines was to lose against the embodiment of everything they had been taught to despise: flexibility, individual initiative, and pragmatic courage. For Japanese defenders, one of the most demoralizing revelations came when they realized the Marines never truly fought alone. Every Marine rifleman was part of a vast synchronized machine, a system of warfare that stretched from the beachhead to the distant horizon. Before the Marines even set foot on an island, the landscape itself was reshaped by American firepower. From miles offshore, U.S. Navy battleships and cruisers pounded Japanese fortifications for hours, sometimes days, with high explosive shells. The sky rumbled as carrier-based aircraft strafed trenches, dropped bombs, and burned through jungle foliage. When the Marines finally landed, they advanced under the shadow of floating fortresses that followed them like steel guardians. To the Japanese, this coordination was inhuman. It erased the romantic idea of honorable man-to-man combat. The enemy was no longer an opponent. It was a system, impersonal and unstoppable. A Japanese survivor of Tarawa later described it bluntly. "We could not fight the sea. We could not fight the sky. And yet the Marines came from both." Behind every Marine platoon stood the logistical genius of the American war machine. Food, ammunition, medical care, engineering, everything the Imperial Army struggled to supply was delivered to the front lines by the ton. The Marines could replace a battalion's losses within days. Japan could not replace them at all. To the Japanese soldier entrenched on some forgotten atoll, it was like fighting the tide itself. Captured diaries, interrogation reports, and wartime intelligence briefings reveal how deep this perception ran. By 1944, entire Japanese garrisons were being briefed before battles about the beastly endurance of U.S. Marines. Leaflets and officers' speeches described them as Nihon no Tekikishin, the enemy's spirit. Incarnate, the fear was not born from propaganda, but from experience. When the Marines landed, the Japanese understood what followed. Days of bombardment, nights of infiltration, and then the steady, merciless advance. In contrast to the Imperial Army's heroic but suicidal banzai charges, the Marines approached war like craftsmen. Every movement, from a squad's leap forward to the call for naval gunfire, was a measured act of destruction. The Japanese, who survived long enough to observe this, learned to respect it, even as they loathed it. One captured officer from the 18th Infantry Regiment said, "They are not like other Americans. They move like hunters. They fight in silence, as if the jungle itself obeys them." In caves and tunnels, Japanese soldiers would whisper among themselves when the shelling stopped, "Kaigun Tai Da!" It's the Marines. The name alone carried dread. That dread reshaped strategy. On Saipan, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima, Japanese commanders ordered their men to dig deeper, fortify harder, and fight longer than ever before. Not out of hope for victory, but from the grim determination to slow the Marines' inevitable advance. War distorts human morality, but the Pacific conflict twisted it into something uniquely paradoxical. The Japanese hated the Marines not because they were cruel, but because they were impossibly effective. They fought without hatred, yet killed without hesitation. They respected bravery, yet annihilated those who displayed it. To the Japanese warrior ethos, such contradictions were unbearable. It broke the neat hierarchy of moral worth that Bushido depended on. After battles, Marines would bury enemy dead, sometimes marking graves with simple wooden crosses. Japanese scouts reported this with disbelief. To them, compassion from such enemies felt like mockery, as if the Americans were so confident in victory they could afford mercy. Thus, hatred became the only defense against humiliation. To hate the Marines was to reclaim dignity, even in defeat. But deep within that hatred, the Japanese soldier carried something else, an unspoken acknowledgement that he had met his equal, and it terrified him. November 20th, 1943. Betio Island, a speck of coral less than 3 miles long, lay silent under a burning sun. Japanese engineers had transformed it into a fortress. 4,500 elite troops, hundreds of machine guns, and concrete bunkers built to repel any invader. They believed it was impregnable. That morning, the silence shattered. From the horizon came thunder. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of the U.S. Navy opening fire in one of the most intense bombardments of the war. Shells tore through the island, throwing palm trees and men into the air. The Japanese huddled underground, waiting for the inevitable landing. Then came the sound they feared most, the deep, mechanical growl of landing craft, drawing closer through the surf. The U.S. Marines of the 2nd Division were coming ashore. But the tide was wrong. The naval bombardment had failed to destroy many of the Japanese bunkers. The coral reefs stopped many landing craft hundreds of yards short of the beach. Marines were forced to wade through waist-deep water under direct fire. Japanese machine guns opened up. The first wave was mowed down in minutes. Bodies floated among wrecked landing craft. The sea turned red, yet still they advanced, crawling, swimming, dragging wounded comrades through the surf. Every few yards, another Marine fell, but the line never broke. Those who reached the sand clawed at the ground for cover. Grenades burst, sand and smoke filled the air, and voices shouted through the chaos, "Keep moving! Keep pushing forward!" To the Japanese defenders, it was madness, suicidal determination unlike anything they had seen. A Japanese sergeant later wrote, "We fired until our guns overheated, but the enemy kept coming. They were not men, they were iron." By the end of the first day, only a fraction of the Marines had reached the shore alive. Yet by the next morning, they had begun to organize, calling in airstrikes and naval support with terrifying precision. Each pillbox that had survived the bombardment was destroyed one by flamethrowers, demolition charges, and point-blank rifle fire. On the third day, the Japanese launched a massive banzai counterattack. Screaming, hundreds of soldiers charged through smoke and debris. The Marines held. They did not run. They fired until the barrels of their machine guns glowed red. When the last attacker fell, silence returned, broken only by the sound of waves against bodies. When the battle ended after just 76 hours, the island was nothing but ruin. Of the 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 survived. Nearly 1,000 Marines lay dead, another 2,100 wounded. A price so steep, it shocked the American public. But within the ranks, the mood was different. For the Marines, Tarawa was not just a victory. It was proof. Proof that no fortress could stop them, and no enemy could outlast them. For Japan, the battle was a revelation of horror. Imperial reports circulated warning that the Marine landing force cannot be resisted through ordinary means. Commanders realized that if Betio, one of their most fortified outposts, could fall in 3 days, nothing was safe. What the Japanese called the Tarawa nightmare would haunt every defender that followed. From that point onward, any garrison that learned the Marines were coming prepared not for survival, but for annihilation. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, and in its place, a new myth arose: the unstoppable Marines. Iwo Jima, where hatred met respect. February 19, 1945. The volcano of Suribachi loomed over a barren island of black ash. Iwo Jima, 21 square kilometers of hell. For the Japanese, this island was sacred ground, the final shield before the homeland. For the Marines, it was a stepping stone, the key to securing airfields needed to bomb Japan itself. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the Japanese garrison, had studied the Americans. He knew frontal defense was suicide. Instead, he built an underground empire, 11 miles of tunnels, bunkers carved into rock, hidden artillery that could fire and disappear. His goal was not victory, but delay, to bleed the Marines so badly that Japan might negotiate from strength. When the bombardment began, it seemed as if the island itself was being torn apart. Battleships and aircraft rained steel upon it for 3 days. But when the shelling stopped and the Marines advanced across the beaches, nothing moved. Then, all at once, the island came alive. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery erupted from invisible positions. Within minutes, the pristine landing beaches turned into a killing field. Entire platoons vanished in blasts of shrapnel. Marines crawled forward inch by inch, each yard bought with blood. The Japanese fought from below, vanishing into tunnels after each strike. There were no front lines, only chaos. The Marines adapted the only way they knew how, through relentless momentum. Flamethrower teams advanced under covering fire, burning out caves and sealing tunnels. Engineers detonated charges to collapse fortifications. Every crater, every bunker became a new battle. Kuribayashi's troops refused to surrender. The Marines refused to stop. For 36 days, the island became a living tomb. Japanese soldiers wrote farewell letters that would never be sent. Marines slept in the open, surrounded by the dead. Rain mixed with volcanic ash until the ground itself became black mud. It was here that both sides glimpsed the purest form of their enemy's spirit. The Japanese saw Americans who would advance into machine gun fire to drag a wounded comrade to safety. The Marines saw defenders who fought to the last bullet, then charged with bayonets, preferring death to capture. When Mount Suribachi was finally captured, the flag raising, immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's photograph, became a symbol not only of victory, but of endurance. Yet even then, the battle was far from over. More Marines would die in the next 2 weeks than in the entire D-Day invasion of Europe. By the time the fighting ended, nearly 7,000 Marines lay dead. Of 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken alive. Kuribayashi himself was never found. His final message, intercepted by Tokyo, read, "The enemy's power is tremendous. We are dying, but our deaths are not in vain. Each Marine we kill costs him 100 steps closer to Japan." That message captured the essence of why the Japanese hated and respected the Marines above all others. They saw in them the same devotion they prized in themselves, but without the fatalism. The Marines fought not to die, but to win, and that made them far more dangerous. After Iwo Jima, even Japanese high command privately admitted that the Marines represented a kind of modern Bushido, one powered not by divine loyalty, but by human brotherhood and determination. To every surviving Japanese soldier who escaped that island, the memory of the Marines lingered. They had looked into the eyes of an enemy who fought with the same ferocity, but for life instead of death. It was no longer simple hatred. It was recognition. When the guns fell silent over Iwo Jima, the Pacific was forever changed. The Japanese Empire had lost another island, but what truly died there was something deeper. The illusion that the Imperial Army could ever stop the American Marine Corps through sheer willpower. The war reports that reached Tokyo in March 1945 were grim, almost reverent. Commanders spoke not only of defeat, but of a new kind of enemy, one who combined discipline, industrial power, and spiritual resilience in equal measure. The Americans had always been known for material abundance, tanks, planes, and ships without limit. But now, the Japanese had witnessed something worse. Americans who fought as if they had nothing to lose. The Marines became symbols of that transformation. Captured intelligence notes from the final months of the war reveal a shift in tone. Phrases like unyielding spirit, inhuman endurance, and soldiers of fire began appearing in Japanese briefings. The hatred was still there, but it was laced with admiration. Even Imperial officers who despised American material warfare confessed privately that the Marines' small unit tenacity was extraordinary. One surviving Japanese lieutenant from the island of Peleliu later told an interviewer, "They did not stop. Even after being burned or wounded, they crawled toward us. We shot one, and another replaced him. It was like fighting the ocean." That was the defining image. The ocean. The Marines came like waves, relentless, rhythmic, unstoppable. Every time one was broken on the reef, another crashed in behind him. And yet, amid that fear, the Japanese soldier could not deny the humanity of his opponent. On Saipan, after the final battle, Marines were seen tending to wounded civilians and even enemy soldiers, carrying them to safety. To a culture raised on the belief that enemies were to be exterminated, such behavior was incomprehensible and humiliating. For the Japanese command, this mix of compassion and brutality was intolerable. They hated that their enemy could be both warrior and human. It undermined the very foundation of their ideology. By 1945, Japanese propaganda shifted in tone. Instead of depicting the Marines as mere beasts, they were now called monsters of steel, humans without fear, and invaders blessed by luck and power. These were not insults, they were admissions of powerlessness. As American forces pushed closer to the Japanese mainland, soldiers stationed on Okinawa were warned explicitly. If the Marines land, fight until the last man. They will take no prisoners, not because they are cruel, but because they will not stop. That belief, that the Marines were an unstoppable force, spread through the ranks like wildfire. Many Japanese troops, already demoralized and starving, entered battle convinced that death was inevitable. For some, hatred became a comfort. For others, it became surrender to fate. When the final battles came, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and the air raids on Japan's cities, the word Marine had already transcended meaning. It was no longer a branch of the American military. It was an idea, a symbol of inevitability, precision, and dread. Even the emperor's senior advisors acknowledged that continued resistance was futile. The American industrial machine might have crushed Japan eventually, but it was the psychological impact of the Marines, their tenacity, their refusal to break, that broke the Japanese spirit first. The hatred had done its work, but it had also turned into resignation. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific was a graveyard of shattered islands, each one marked by the same story. Japanese defenders who fought to extinction, and Marines who refused to stop until the flag was raised. From Tarawa to Iwo Jima, from Saipan to Okinawa, the pattern never changed. The Japanese called it the Marine Curse, the knowledge that once those men landed, their fate was sealed. No fortification was safe, no tunnel deep enough, no strategy clever enough to survive their advance. After the surrender, U.S. occupation forces uncovered boxes of field notes and diaries from dead Japanese officers. Many contained the same word repeated over and over: Kaigun Tai, the Marine Unit. To them, that term had become synonymous with hopelessness. One diary from the 43rd Infantry Regiment, found in the ruins of Okinawa, read, "We once believed we were the strongest soldiers in the world. Then came the Marines. They do not fear death as we do. They respect it, but they master it." This quiet admission revealed the transformation of emotion over the course of the war. What began as contempt, the idea that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and weak, evolved into bitter awe. Japanese officers began teaching new recruits to expect defeat, not from cowardice, but from inevitability. Even after Japan's surrender, the image of the Marines lingered in the nation's consciousness. Post-war Japanese veterans associations often described the Marines with a mix of hatred and admiration. They were the embodiment of everything Japan had once sought to become: efficient, fearless, united in purpose. General Kuribayashi's surviving staff officers, interrogated after Iwo Jima, were asked what they thought of the Marines. One answered simply, "They fought like we were supposed to fight." That sentence haunted historians for decades. It symbolized a mutual recognition that transcended propaganda. Two warrior cultures staring into the same mirror. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, a strange irony took hold. Many Japanese officers and strategists began studying the very marine doctrine they once despised. Amphibious warfare, small unit tactics, and the principle of coordinated assault became central topics at Japan's post-war defense academies. The unit they had once hated most became their model for the future. Meanwhile, on the American side, the memory of those battles became sacred. The Marine Corps emerged from the Pacific not as a branch of the military, but as a legend. The phrase, "once a Marine, always a Marine," gained weight from those black sands and blood-soaked jungles. For the veterans who had faced the Japanese, the hatred had faded, replaced by respect for a formidable foe. "They fought for their homeland," one Marine said decades later, "just as we fought for ours." In the end, the story of why Japanese soldiers hated fighting American Marines is not one of hatred at all, but of recognition. Both sides were forged by discipline, molded by hardship, and bound to an ideal greater than themselves. The difference lay in what they fought for. The Japanese warrior fought to die well. The Marine fought to live well, and to bring his brothers home. That distinction changed everything. It made the Marine not only dangerous, but immortal. He did not seek glory or martyrdom. He sought completion of duty. When faced with overwhelming fire, he advanced. When wounded, he fought on. When surrounded, he held his ground. To the Japanese, that was a mirror they could not bear to face, a reflection of their own spirit, but without surrender to death. In the Pacific, they found an enemy that could match their devotion, but channel it through reason instead of ritual, courage instead of ceremony. The war between them became more than a clash of nations. It was a philosophical reckoning between a code of sacrifice and a creed of endurance. When peace finally came, the hatred faded. What remained was respect, the kind only born in shared suffering. Japanese veterans would later speak of the Marines not as enemies, but as warriors worthy of memory. American Marines, in turn, never forgot the ferocity of their foes. On the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima, where both sides bled into the same earth, the two nations' destinies intertwined. The Marines' victory was built on courage, but also on tragedy, discipline, and the recognition that war strips all men down to their essence. And so, when historians ask why Japanese troops feared the Marines above all others, the answer lies not in tactics or weapons, but in spirit. Because in that war, the Marines did not just fight to win, they fought to endure. And through that endurance, they became the standard by which all enemies, even the most devoted, would measure themselves. The Japanese hated fighting the Marines, because in them they saw the unbreakable version of themselves.